The history of royal mistresses is often framed in the context of scandal and lust, but their rise to prominence in the courts of Europe and beyond tells a story that is far more complex. For centuries, royal mistresses occupied a paradoxical position, both at the apex of power and, at times, on the edge of disgrace. Their rise was not just the result of a romantic relationship with a monarch, but of a strategic interplay of beauty, charm, intellect, and political savvy. The ability to secure the favor of a king or queen in such a volatile environment required more than just physical allure. It required cunning, timing, and the ability to manipulate the intricacies of court politics. The first royal mistresses were often the product of necessity. In a time when marriage was primarily about political alliances and dynastic preservation, monarchs often turned to mistresses for affection, pleasure, and even political leverage. These women were typically drawn from the ranks of noble families, and, unlike the queen, their relationships with the king were not bound by the same expectations of producing heirs or advancing national interests. Instead, they existed in a unique space where they could wield influence without the strict confines of courtly diplomacy and royal duty. In the early days, the king's mistress often rose to power by capturing his attention and keeping it. This could be achieved through any number of means, from beauty to intelligence to sheer determination. The path of a royal mistress was rarely straightforward. Take, for example, Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France. Diane was a woman of striking beauty and sharp intellect, but it was her ability to capture Henry's attention at a young age that allowed her to rise to unparalleled heights at the French court. She was deeply involved in the politics of the time, using her influence to secure key positions and ensure the success of her allies. Diane wasn't simply the king's lover. She was his confidant, a political player in her own right. Her position as mistress was not just about fulfilling the king's desires. Diane de Poitiers secured her role through careful management of courtly intrigue. She had a deep understanding of the political dynamics at play and used that knowledge to cultivate alliances with powerful families and courtiers. She would attend important meetings and had the king's ear on matters that affected the entire realm. As a result, Diane became not only the most important woman at the court, but also one of the most influential political figures in 16th century France. While Diane's rise was largely a result of her intelligence and beauty, the next wave of mistresses would come to understand that securing the king's favor could be as much about cultural influence as it was about personal allure. A prime example of this is Madame de Pompadour, the infamous mistress of King Louis XV of France. Pompadour's rise is particularly notable because, unlike many mistresses who were only involved in the king's personal life, she also became a powerful figure in the cultural and political spheres of France. Madame de Pompadour was not just another beautiful woman who caught the king's eye. She was a woman of incredible intellect, with a keen understanding of art, politics, and culture. Louis XV, though not particularly handsome or charismatic, was captivated by Pompadour's charm, wit, and knowledge. She quickly became his favorite, and over time, she used her position to become an unofficial political advisor. Her influence stretched far beyond the royal bedroom, and she is credited with shaping the arts and culture in France during the Rococo period. Pompadour was also involved in the political affairs of the court, influencing important decisions and even helping to secure alliances that had significant consequences for France's place in Europe. Her influence was so great that she became a central figure in the administration, able to command the attention of the king even in the midst of courtly disputes. Pompadour's legacy, however, was not just in the political realm. She also played a critical role in supporting French art and architecture, commissioning works that defined an entire era. In contrast to the political sophistication of Madame de Pompadour, some royal mistresses rose to power through sheer charisma and the ability to capture the heart of their monarch. Nell Gwyn, the famous mistress of King Charles II of England, is perhaps one of the most iconic examples of a royal mistress who used her charm and wit to climb the social ladder. Born into poverty, Nell started as an actress in the London theatre scene, but her beauty and quick humor soon caught the eye of the king. Though Nell Gwyn did not have the political influence of Pompadour or Diane de Poitiers, she was beloved by the public and was an important figure at the English court. Her charm, humor, and the ability to make the king laugh were enough to secure her place in the king's inner circle. In contrast to the often politically driven mistresses, Nell Gwyn's influence at court was more personal, relying on the emotional connection she had with the king. She was able to use that connection to secure financial support for her family, but her power was never as institutionalized as that of other mistresses. Yet even in the case of women like Nell Gwyn, the political role of the royal mistress could not be understated. While Nell may not have been involved in the formal political decisions of the day, her ability to sway the king's mood and influence the affairs of the court was no small feat. Her alliances with key figures in court were also instrumental in maintaining her status and ensuring that she remained a fixture in the king's life. Charles II was known for having multiple mistresses, but it was Nell Gwyn who ultimately won his heart. Royal mistresses also became key players in dynastic politics, sometimes even securing marriages and alliances that would influence future generations. This was especially true for mistresses who were able to bear the king's children. While many royal mistresses were excluded from the royal succession, their children often became key players in royal politics. For example, King Charles II of England had several illegitimate children, including James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. Though Monmouth was not in line for the throne, his mother, Lucy Walter, was a mistress of the king, and her influence ensured that her son had some degree of political support. Royal mistresses were also central to the image and reputation of the royal family. In some cases, they played the role of the king's companion when the queen was either absent or politically inconvenient. Their presence at court helped bolster the king's image, providing him with the companionship that a king was often thought to require. But their relationships were always marked by a fine balance. Madame de Pompadour, for example, was keenly aware that the king's official wife still had her own status to uphold, and she worked diligently to ensure that her own position did not undermine the queen's authority. She understood that her influence could never come at the expense of the queen's legitimacy. The rise of royal mistresses was thus a multifaceted phenomenon. Their relationships with kings were complex, often involving more than just affection or desire. They wielded influence, shaped culture, and played pivotal roles in the political dynamics of their time. Through wit, charm, and political savvy, these women were able to secure their places at the highest echelons of court life, leaving legacies that were both profound and enduring. When we talk about the power of royal mistresses, we aren't simply referring to the ability to influence a king's affections. Royal mistresses were often power brokers in their own right. They weren't just women who existed in the shadows of the monarchy. They were women who controlled significant portions of the royal court and, in some cases, entire countries. The power dynamics at play in these relationships were complex, with the mistresses navigating a labyrinth of royal politics, court intrigues, and societal expectations. Let's look at one of the most influential royal mistresses in European history, Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of King Louis XV of France. Madame de Pompadour was not just a pretty face at the court. She was a political powerhouse. When she first entered the king's life, she was a mere commoner, born into a family of modest means. But through her intelligence, charm, and sophistication, she quickly caught the king's eye. She rose from being one of the king's many lovers to becoming the royal mistress, the king's closest confidant, and, for many, a surrogate ruler in her own right. Madame de Pompadour's influence extended well beyond her private relationship with Louis XV. She was deeply involved in the political and cultural spheres of French society. In fact, Pompadour was instrumental in shaping the course of French politics during her tenure as Louis XV's mistress. Her influence over the king allowed her to play a significant role in the appointment of ministers and the shaping of France's foreign and domestic policies. While it was common for kings to have mistresses, it was unprecedented for one to wield such political power. Pompadour's ability to exercise influence over the king meant that she could change the course of history, not only within the royal court, but also on the battlefield and in diplomacy. She helped shape France's alliances and managed court politics with skill, often acting as a mediator between the king and the various factions that vied for his attention. One of her most notable achievements was her patronage of the arts and culture. Madame de Pompadour became a patroness of the arts, commissioning works from the finest artists of the day. Under her guidance, French art, architecture, and music flourished. She was instrumental in the promotion of the Rococo style, commissioning artists like François Boucher to produce some of the most iconic works of the 18th century. The royal court, under Pompadour's influence, became a center for culture, fostering creativity and establishing France as the cultural capital of Europe. But this was more than just an artistic endeavor. It was a conscious effort to cement her legacy and influence the cultural direction of the monarchy. Through art and culture, Pompadour subtly reinforced her position as a central figure in the French court, elevating her status and further embedding her role within the royal system. Pompadour's political influence extended to her ability to manage the king's relationships with ministers, advisors, and even foreign diplomats. As the king's mistress, she had unprecedented access to the king's decisions and was able to exert subtle pressure on matters ranging from foreign diplomacy to internal political appointments. One example of her political power came during her involvement in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. While the war was a disaster for France, Pompadour's influence over Louis XV meant that she was often consulted on matters of strategy and diplomacy, shaping the course of the conflict. She was a woman in a man's world, and yet she held sway over the king and his ministers, steering the kingdom's decisions as much as any official in the government. But the power of a royal mistress wasn't confined to the court of France. Let's turn to Nell Gwyn, the famous mistress of King Charles II of England, whose influence and political savvy left a lasting mark on English history. Unlike Pompadour, Nell was not born into wealth or nobility. She started as an orange seller in the streets of London and eventually became an actress, performing in some of the most popular plays of the day. It was her charm, wit, and beauty that caught the eye of King Charles II, and soon she became one of his most beloved mistresses. While Nell Gwyn may not have been a political mastermind in the same way Madame de Pompadour was, she was no less influential in her own right. She understood the dynamics of court politics and used her position to secure benefits for herself, her family, and her allies. At a time when political patronage was essential to social mobility, Nell became a crucial figure in court society. She had the king's ear, and through her relationship with him, she was able to secure favorable positions for her family and influence the political landscape of England. She didn't just bask in the king's affection. She used it to advance her own agenda and the interests of those closest to her. But Nell's influence extended beyond the political realm. Her presence in the royal court also had significant social and cultural implications. As a commoner who rose to prominence through her relationship with the king, Nell Gwyn represented a departure from the traditional notions of power and class in England. She proved that anyone, regardless of their birth, could rise to the highest echelons of society, if they had the right kind of charm, wit, and the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court. Nell's rise from humble beginnings to the heights of royal favor embodied the idea that access to power and influence was not solely dependent on birthright or noble blood. She was a woman who, through sheer personality and determination, carved out a place for herself in the annals of English history. In contrast to the more politically astute Pompadour, Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter of the infamous Pope Alexander VI, represents a different form of power that comes from both family connections and intimate relations with powerful men. Lucrezia's life is filled with drama, intrigue, and scandal, but it's also a story of political ambition and a desire for control. Born into one of the most powerful and controversial families in Italy, Lucrezia's relationships with high-ranking men were both a means of gaining power and a tool of survival. Her life was shaped by the actions of her family, particularly her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, Cesare Borgia. As a mistress to various powerful men, including dukes and cardinals, Lucrezia used her relationships to advance the Borgia family's political agenda. At a time when Italy was fragmented and divided into numerous city-states, the Borgia family sought to consolidate power and increase their influence over the papal states. Through Lucrezia's marriages and relationships, the Borgias were able to strengthen their grip on power, form political alliances, and expand their territorial holdings. In some cases, Lucrezia was married off to men who could bring the Borgias strategic advantages. Her role as a mistress was also tied to this political maneuvering. In this sense, her relationships were not just about passion or love. They were about power. Lucrezia's story is a reminder that the power of a royal mistress didn't just come from personal charm or affection for the king. For women like Lucrezia, their relationships were part of a larger political strategy. As a mistress, she was often a pawn in a larger game of family power struggles, alliances, and territorial control. Her relationships with powerful men served the Borgia family's agenda, ensuring that they maintained their influence in the volatile political landscape of Renaissance Italy. Lucrezia's story is one of survival and political calculation, where every relationship, every alliance, and every move was a calculated step toward greater control. When we talk about the power of a royal mistress, it's clear that their influence went far beyond the bedroom. These women were not just lovers. They were politicians, diplomats, and advisors. Their ability to manipulate the king's affections and use their position to influence royal decisions was what truly set them apart from other women at court. A royal mistress didn't just enjoy the luxury of royal life. She had access to power. And with that access came the ability to influence everything from political decisions to cultural trends, shaping the course of history through their intimate relationships with the most powerful men of the time. Being a royal mistress was about so much more than luxury and romance. Sure, these women were often gifted with lavish estates, rich jewelry, and all the material perks one could imagine. But let's dive deeper into what these perks actually meant for the royal mistresses. It wasn't just about living the good life. It was about what those perks represented. Power, security, and influence in a world where those who didn't have them often lived in uncertainty or ruin. One of the most significant perks of being a royal mistress was security. Imagine living in a world where your future wasn't dictated by your birth, your social standing, or your family's wealth. As a royal mistress, you could secure not only your personal wealth, but also that of your family and any offspring you might have. Take Madame de Pompadour, for example. Not only did she enjoy immense material wealth, but she also helped her family secure titles and positions of power within the French court. Her influence extended to her relatives, ensuring that they benefited from her relationship with Louis XV. This wasn't just about personal luxury. It was about generational security. Nell Gwyn, too, understood the importance of securing her position within the royal court. By becoming the mistress of Charles II, she ensured that her family rose in status, gaining lands and wealth that they could never have dreamed of as commoners. Through her relationship with the king, Nell was able to rise above her humble beginnings, securing the future of her children and even gaining political favors that would have been impossible to attain otherwise. This access to the king's court allowed her to become a key player in English politics, able to use her position to her advantage in ways that would be unimaginable for most women of her time. Being a royal mistress was about so much more than luxury and romance. Sure, these women were often gifted with lavish estates, rich jewelry, and all the material perks one could imagine. But let's dive deeper into what these perks actually meant for the royal mistresses. It wasn't just about living the good life. It was about what those perks represented: power, security, and influence in a world where those who didn't have them often lived in uncertainty or ruin. One of the most significant perks of being a royal mistress was security. Imagine living in a world where your future wasn't dictated by your birth, your social standing, or your family's wealth. As a royal mistress, you could secure not only your personal wealth, but also that of your family and any offspring you might have. Take Madame de Pompadour, for example. Not only did she enjoy immense material wealth, but she also helped her family secure titles and positions of power within the French court. Her influence extended to her relatives, ensuring that they benefited from her relationship with Louis XV. This wasn't just about personal luxury, it was about generational security. Nell Gwyn, too, understood the importance of securing her position within the royal court. By becoming the mistress of Charles II, she ensured that her family rose in status, gaining lands and wealth that they could never have dreamed of as commoners. Through her relationship with the king, Nell was able to rise above her humble beginnings, securing the future of her children and even gaining political favors that would have been impossible to attain otherwise. This access to the king's court allowed her to become a key player in English politics, able to use her position to her advantage in ways that would be unimaginable for most women of her time. Another significant perk of being a royal mistress was the luxury that came with the position. And I'm not talking about just a nice gown or a good meal. Royal mistresses were given access to the finest things in life. Take Madame de Pompadour's lifestyle, for example. She lived in luxury that was unparalleled, with access to the most prestigious artists, musicians, and architects of her time. She didn't just live in a beautiful palace. She shaped the very culture of the French court, ensuring that the art, architecture, and music of the time reflected her taste. It was a level of luxury that was unheard of, especially for someone who wasn't born into nobility. But even more than the material perks, a royal mistress had access. And access is the most powerful perk of all. When you were the mistress of a king, you weren't just invited to the ball. You were invited to the most important meetings, the most exclusive dinners, and the most significant moments in history. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, didn't just attend royal events. She hosted them. She had the king's ear whenever she needed it, allowing her to influence royal decisions on military strategy, foreign policy, and even the king's appointments. The real perk wasn't the jewels or the gowns. It was the power that came from having a king's attention and affection. But, as with all things, the perks came with risks. The power and prestige of being a royal mistress came at a cost. These women lived in a world of intense scrutiny. Their every move was watched, and their position was always precarious. They were always one step away from losing the king's favor, and in a world of fierce court rivalries, a mistress who fell out of favor could quickly find herself with nothing. So, while the perks were real and tantalizing, they were never guaranteed. Even a woman as influential as Madame de Pompadour faced challenges, especially as the king's interests shifted. A mistress who didn't maintain the king's affection risked losing everything, including her place at court. While being a royal mistress may have come with immense power, prestige, and luxury, it was not without its perils. The life of a mistress to a king was always precarious. These women lived in a delicate balance between favor and disgrace, luxury and ruin. A royal mistress could enjoy a lavish lifestyle one day, only to find herself cast aside and forgotten the next. The downfall of a mistress was often swift and unforgiving, as the fickle nature of royal attention and court politics made their position one of constant uncertainty. Let's take a deeper dive into the perils these women faced and explore the dangers that came with the power they wielded. The most immediate peril was the loss of the king's favor. The king's attention could be fleeting, and for many royal mistresses, this was their greatest vulnerability. The king might fall in love with someone else, or a new, younger mistress might enter the picture. When the king's attention shifted, the mistress's position became extremely fragile. A mistress who was once the king's confidant and advisor could be replaced with no warning, And with that replacement came the risk of losing all her influence and privileges. Take La Pompadour, for example. Madame de Pompadour's long-standing relationship with Louis XV was marked by constant rivalries with other women at court, as new mistresses vied for the king's affection. Her reign as Louis's favorite lasted for years, but even she had to contend with the possibility of being replaced. Despite her immense influence, she was never truly secure. Her downfall came with the death of Louis XV and the eventual rise of a younger, more beautiful mistress who captured the king's attention. For many royal mistresses, the risk of falling from grace was a constant reality. The king, who once lavished them with gifts and attention, could suddenly discard them in favor of a new passion. Once that affection was lost, a mistress could easily be discarded, and with her disappearance from the king's bed came a swift fall from the court's favor. The process of being replaced wasn't always as gentle as it was for Pompadour. Some mistresses found themselves cast aside cruelly, their titles stripped, their wealth dissipated, and their futures uncertain. But even worse than the loss of the king's favor was the threat of scandal and public disgrace. Royal courts were full of whispers, rumors, and intrigue, and a mistress who found herself out of favor could quickly become the subject of vicious gossip. The public's perception of a royal mistress was often colored by their relationship with the king, and if that relationship turned sour, the mistress could easily find herself vilified. For example, Nell Gwyn, though beloved by the public, faced constant ridicule and scorn from her rivals in the court. As a commoner who rose to the highest ranks of society through her relationship with the king, she was often derided as a social climber or a whore, despite her political acumen and charm. Her rise to power was met with skepticism and jealousy, and once her relationship with Charles II began to wane, she was quickly subjected to the sharp tongues of the courtiers who once adored her. The public's perception of royal mistresses was shaped by the complex relationship between sex, power, and reputation in the royal court. A mistress was expected to be both desirable and discreet. If a mistress was perceived as having too much influence, or if her relationship with the king was seen as too public, she could be condemned for whoring or selling her virtue for political gain. Women like Lucrezia Borgia, who were already at the center of scandalous rumor, found themselves constantly fighting the tides of public opinion. Lucrezia's relationship with her brother, Cesare Borgia, and the accusations surrounding her involvement in political assassinations made her a target for gossip and slander. Even though she was used as a pawn in the Borgia family's political games, her image as a ruthless femme fatale stuck, despite her attempts to play the role of a loving wife and mother. Lucrezia's involvement with various powerful men made her an object of both lust and suspicion, and she could never escape the shadow of scandal that haunted her. Another peril faced by royal mistresses was the danger of jealousy. Jealousy could come from all sides: the king's official wife, other mistresses, or even the courtiers who resented the power and favor the mistress enjoyed. A royal mistress was often thrust into a battle for power with the queen and other women at court. The queen, of course, had the ultimate power as the king's legitimate wife, but many mistresses found ways to assert their influence even over the queen. Catherine Henriette de Balzac d'Entragues, for instance, became the mistress of King Henry IV of France and wielded substantial power in court politics. But her relationship with the king made her a target for other women, including the queen herself, who despised her. The queen, seeing the influence of the mistress, plotted her downfall, using court intrigue and manipulation to push the king's affections away from her. Jealousy could also come from the king himself. Many kings were known to be possessive of their mistresses, seeing them as personal property. But when a mistress became too powerful or too popular, it could lead to competition. A king who feared his mistress might try to control him or outmaneuver him politically could act to assert his control. This was especially dangerous in courts that were rife with intrigue. Royal mistresses often had to navigate the king's affections delicately, knowing that any perceived imbalance in favor could result in their downfall. Françoise d'Aubigné, the mistress of Louis XIV, was able to maintain her position for many years due to her clever management of the king's affection. However, her rival, Madame de Montespan, once held the king's favor more intensely and used her power to manipulate court decisions and politics. The tension between the two mistresses was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before one of them would fall from grace. Moreover, the perils of royal mistresses were also physical. As the stories of jealousy, scandal, and manipulation played out in the court of public opinion, the reality for some mistresses was far more violent. In the case of Christine de Pizan, a writer and poet who had an affair with King Charles VI of France, her status as a mistress led her to become a target for political enemies. Christine, who had already established herself as an influential writer, became a victim of hostile court factions who wanted to destroy her reputation and silence her influence. She faced harassment, physical threats, and even attempted assassinations by those who viewed her as a threat to the established order. Royal mistresses could easily become pawns in court politics, and their safety was never guaranteed. The ultimate peril, of course, came with the prospect of death. A royal mistress who lost favor could be punished in a variety of ways, from being publicly humiliated to being exiled. In some cases, they were even executed, particularly if their actions were seen as treasonous or if their relationships with the king were deemed scandalous by court officials. Caroline of Ansbach, who had once been the mistress to Frederick the Great of Prussia, found herself in a precarious position after her relationship with the king ended. Her former lover turned against her, and she was forced to flee the court to avoid death. The harsh reality for royal mistresses was that they were, in many ways, expendable. If they lost their charm, their influence, or the king's favor, they could be tossed aside. In some cases, the fall from grace was quick and brutal, and the mistress's death could even be framed as an act of divine retribution. In other cases, it was simply the end of their political power. Lady Castlemaine, the mistress of King Charles II of England, fell into disfavor after the king's affection shifted to another woman. She spent her remaining years in exile, abandoned and forgotten by the court that once adored him. But perhaps the greatest peril faced by royal mistresses was the psychological toll. The constant stress of maintaining favor with the king, the ever-present jealousy of rivals, and the underlying sense of vulnerability weighed heavily on these women. Their position was one built on impermanence, and the specter of losing everything was always lurking around the corner. The pressure to remain relevant and influential was enough to drive many royal mistresses to despair, with some even resorting to drastic measures to secure their position. The life of a royal mistress, then, was not just one of indulgence and luxury. It was a high-stakes game where every win could be fleeting and every loss could be devastating. Royal mistresses, despite the many risks and perils they faced, have often left behind a legacy that shaped the course of history in ways that are both subtle and profound. Their influence extended far beyond the royal court. Their actions, decisions, and the power they wielded rippled through society, politics, art, and culture. The legacy of a royal mistress often became intertwined with the broader story of their respective nations, sometimes even shaping the destinies of dynasties. From the arts and architecture to diplomacy and the rise of new power structures, the marks left by royal mistresses can still be felt centuries later. One of the most significant legacies of royal mistresses lies in their cultural impact. These women, often seen as mere objects of desire, became powerful cultural figures in their own right. Madame de Pompadour, for example, had a profound influence on the cultural landscape of France. While she may have started as Louis XV's mistress, she quickly became one of the most powerful women in Europe. As a patroness of the arts, Pompadour was responsible for fostering the Rococo style, an artistic movement that emphasized elegance, beauty, and a playful lightness. The French court under her influence was the birthplace of some of the most iconic art, furniture, and architecture of the 18th century. Pompadour's legacy in the arts is particularly evident in the works of François Boucher, her personal painter, whose sensual and ornate paintings defined the Rococo period. These works were not just a reflection of the king's mistress's taste. They were carefully curated to project an image of the monarchy that was at once refined, extravagant, and intimately connected with the pleasures of the court. Madame de Pompadour understood that her legacy would be one that would outlast her time at court, and she used her patronage to ensure that France's cultural heritage would reflect her personal tastes and political influence. The palaces, salons, and gardens that were constructed during her time would stand as testament to her legacy, influencing French art and design for generations to come. Beyond art, the influence of royal mistresses often shaped the political landscape of their respective nations. For many mistresses, their relationships with kings or princes were not only about love or intimacy, they were deeply entwined with political maneuvering. Madame de Montespan, another of Louis XIV's famous mistresses, used her relationship with the French king to solidify her own power at court. Though she was eventually replaced by Madame de Maintenon, her legacy was a deeply entrenched one. Montespan's influence on Louis XIV, particularly in matters of court appointments and patronage, meant that she left a lasting imprint on the royal court. Her ability to help shape the political landscape during her time as mistress ensured that she remained a powerful figure in French history. Her position in the court was also instrumental in establishing the rules of court etiquette and governance that would govern France for generations. The French court under Louis XIV was one of the most sophisticated and complex in Europe, and the mistress was often a central figure in courtly life. Montespan's rivalry with other courtiers and mistresses like Madame de Maintenon also shaped the balance of power within the court. This constant power struggle created a political environment in which allegiances shifted regularly, and the royal mistress became a key figure in shaping the direction of the court's policies. In England, Nell Gwyn was also involved in the political maneuverings of the court. While she may have started her relationship with Charles II as a way to gain favor and status, her position in the royal court allowed her to act as a powerful intermediary between the king and his ministers. By acting as a go-between, Nell Gwyn was able to influence the decisions of Charles II, ensuring that her allies in court were able to rise to positions of power and influence. This sort of political maneuvering was crucial during a time of intense factionalism in the English court. Nell Gwyn's legacy extends beyond her relationship with Charles II. She was also a symbol of social mobility and the idea that anyone, even someone of humble origins, could rise to a position of power with the right mix of charm, wit, and strategic thinking. The influence of royal mistresses wasn't confined to the courts of France or England. In Russia, the legacy of royal mistresses was particularly marked. Catherine I of Russia, who became the wife of Tsar Peter the Great, started as one of the Tsar's many lovers. Despite being born into poverty and without noble blood, Catherine I rose to power as Peter's confidant and mistress. Her relationship with Peter was not just based on passion, but also political alliance. When Peter died in 1725, Catherine I was able to ascend to the throne as the Empress of Russia, thanks in part to her position as the Tsar's mistress and her involvement in the Tsar's most significant political and military decisions. Catherine I's legacy as a royal mistress turned empress speaks to the political power that a mistress could wield in the Russian Empire. Like other royal mistresses, Catherine I's rise to power was rooted in her ability to use her relationship with the king to secure her position. In many ways, Catherine I's ascension to the throne marked a turning point in Russian history, as it paved the way for the subsequent reigns of Catherine the Great, one of the most famous rulers in Russian history. While Catherine I's reign was brief, she set a precedent for royal mistresses who sought not just affection but the power to rule. The legacies of royal mistresses also extended into the social fabric of their time. For example, Lucrezia Borgia's influence in Renaissance Italy cannot be overstated. While her name has been synonymous with scandal and intrigue, Lucrezia's relationships with powerful men helped her rise above the limitations of her gender and her family's notorious reputation. Despite the scandal that often surrounded the Borgia family, Lucrezia was able to secure powerful marriages and wield significant influence in Italian politics. Her alliances were strategic, and she was able to position herself and her family as key players in the political theater of Renaissance Italy. In addition to their political and cultural legacies, Royal mistresses also played a role in the art of diplomacy and the creation of dynastic lines. While the queen's role was often to bear heirs and secure the royal family's legitimacy, the royal mistress was sometimes able to produce heirs as well. The children of mistresses often held positions of influence in court, and the royal king's children were often treated with the same respect and honors as those born to the official queen. For example, King Charles II of England had several illegitimate children with his mistresses, many of whom were given titles and placed in positions of power. The legacy of these royal bastards would affect the English monarchy and its politics long after the king's death. The role of royal mistresses in creating political alliances and shaping succession is still evident in today's political systems. The children of mistresses, though often excluded from the throne, played a role in securing stability within the royal family and the realm. These children might become military leaders, political figures, or landowners who contributed to the kingdom's growth and success. In many ways, royal mistresses were agents of political and social change, even if their children were never formally recognized as heirs to the throne. Royal mistresses, despite their perceived scandalous roles in history, left behind legacies that were far more complex than mere affairs or intrigues. They were women who leveraged their positions of influence to shape the course of history. From Madame de Pompadour's influence on art and diplomacy to Lucrezia Borgia's political maneuvering, these women were far more than lovers. They were architects of history, shaping the political, cultural, and social landscapes of their time. Their legacies live on in the power structures they helped build, the political alliances they forged, and the art they inspired. While the world may have once viewed them as merely mistresses, history has shown that they were much more than that. These women transformed the role of a royal mistress into a powerful force that shaped not only the courts they inhabited, but the world beyond them. Even as their names have been clouded by scandal, their contributions to the political and cultural heritage of their time remain undeniable. Royal mistresses were powerful women who, through their beauty, intellect, and political acumen, left an indelible mark on history. The rise and power of royal mistresses may have been marked by luxury, political influence, and social cachet, but with these privileges came a heavy price, especially when it came to their downfall. While many royal mistresses enjoyed a life filled with opulence and influence, the specter of their eventual fall from favor was always looming. The downfall of a royal mistress was not always a slow, dignified retreat into obscurity. It could be sudden, dramatic, and often brutal. Their rise was often built on a delicate balance of favor, politics, and timing, and once that balance shifted, their lives could be turned upside down. The downfall of royal mistresses, particularly those who held significant influence in court, was often the result of a complex web of court intrigue, royal politics, and shifting affections. The very same qualities that made them powerful, beauty, charm, and intellect, could quickly turn against them when the king's favor shifted or when a new rival emerged. Take Madame de Montespan, the famous mistress of King Louis XIV of France. Montespan's position at the French court was unmatched for many years. As Louis XIV's favorite, she enjoyed not only his affection but also significant political and cultural influence. However, as with many royal mistresses, her downfall came with the rise of a new woman at court, Madame de Maintenon, who captured the king's affection and eventually replaced Montespan in both the king's heart and his court. But the true catalyst for Montespan's downfall was a scandal that rocked the French court, the so-called Affair of the Poisons. The Affair of the Poisons was a dark and mysterious series of events involving allegations of poisonings, witchcraft, and secret plots at court. Several individuals close to the king's inner circle were accused of poisoning their rivals in an attempt to win favor at court. The affair tarnished the reputations of many at court, including Montespan. Though there was never any definitive proof that Montespan was involved in the poisonings, rumors circulated that she had played a role in the plot. The scandal was enough to force Montespan out of the king's favor. She was no longer the beloved mistress of the Sun King. She was exiled from the court and forced to live in a convent for the rest of her days. Montespan's fall is a poignant reminder of how quickly a royal mistress's life could go from opulent luxury to ignominious exile. The affair of the poisons was a turning point in her relationship with Louis XIV, and it demonstrated just how precarious the position of a royal mistress could be. A woman who once held all the king's favor could find herself ostracized, her wealth and power stripped away. In the high-stakes game of royal mistresses, the risks were as great as the rewards. The fate of Nell Gwyn, the famous mistress of King Charles II of England, was similarly marked by the ever-shifting tides of royal affection. Unlike many royal mistresses who became involved in the politics of the court, Nell Gwyn was known for her charm, wit, and ability to make the king laugh. She was beloved by the public and the king, but when Charles II's health began to fail, the power dynamics at court began to change. With the king's declining health, many courtiers vied for power and influence, and Nell's once favored position at court began to erode. Despite the public's adoration of Nell, the king's attention started to shift to his other mistresses, including the younger Louise de Keroualle, the Duchess of Portsmouth. The shifting affections of the king meant that Nell, once the beloved mistress, began to lose her status. The political power that had come with her relationship with Charles II was slipping away. In addition, the constant rivalry between the various mistresses at court, each one vying for the king's attention, took its toll on Nell's position. While she did not face the same public scandal as Montespan, her eventual downfall was marked by the gradual loss of influence and the king's eventual replacement of her with another mistress. But Nell Gwyn's situation was unique in that, despite the decline in her status at court, she managed to leave behind a lasting legacy. While the affection of the king had waned, she was able to secure financial support for her son, Charles Beauclerc, who was later given a title and lands. Her final years were spent in relative comfort, though the loss of power and prestige was certainly painful. She had gone from being the king's favorite mistress to a woman who was largely excluded from the political intrigues of the court, a victim of the fickleness of royal favor. In a way, Nell's downfall was more a gradual fade into the background of court life, with her once bright star dimming as the king's affection turned elsewhere. Lucrezia Borgia, whose life was marked by the excesses and brutalities of the Renaissance, provides another example of the dangers faced by royal mistresses, particularly in the highly volatile political climate of Italy. The Borgia family, notorious for their ruthless political maneuvers, saw Lucrezia as both a pawn and a power broker, and her relationships with powerful men were instrumental in shaping the Borgia family's legacy. However, the family's notoriety and the intrigue that surrounded their political activities eventually caught up with Lucrezia. Despite her attempts to live a quieter life after her marriages, her association with her family's ruthless ways always threatened to overshadow her. In a twist of fate, Lucrezia's downfall was linked to the rise of her brother, Cesare Borgia, whose ambitions and ruthlessness would lead to his eventual downfall. As Cesare's power waned, Lucrezia's own position weakened, and she was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, often aligning herself with powerful men to protect her own survival. While she was never directly executed or publicly disgraced, Lucrezia's life was forever marked by scandal, intrigue, and the dangerous legacy of the Borgia family. In the case of Catherine Henriette de Balzac d'Entragues, the mistress of King Henry IV of France, her downfall was less about personal scandal and more about the intricate political and courtly rivalries that defined the French court. Catherine's influence at court was undeniable, but she made the mistake of becoming too involved in the political struggles of the French monarchy. She sought to secure a marriage between her daughter and Henry IV, and she began to demand favors from the king that went beyond the typical role of a mistress. Her ambitions led to her eventual fall from grace when Henry IV turned his affections elsewhere, leaving her stranded in the court's complex political landscape. Her overreach ultimately led to her decline. The downfall of royal mistresses was often a complex interplay of court politics, jealousy, and the fickle nature of royal affection. Even the most powerful women at court could be discarded if they lost the favor of the king, and many mistresses found themselves replaced, exiled, or abandoned when the political climate shifted. A mistress could rise from humble beginnings to the highest echelons of society, only to fall victim to the very power dynamics she once mastered. The perils of being a royal mistress were immense, but perhaps the greatest danger was the threat of being forgotten, overlooked, or discarded when the king's interest moved elsewhere. The most poignant downfall of a royal mistress was the complete erasure from history. Women like Madame de Montespan, Nell Gwyn, and Catherine Henriette de Balzac d'Entragues were ultimately discarded, their legacies clouded by scandal, betrayal, or mere forgetfulness. Their stories serve as cautionary tales for women who, even at the heights of power, were always at the mercy of royal whims and the shifting currents of court life. While these women left indelible marks on history, their downfalls remind us of the perils of impermanence, the harsh reality that, in the world of royal mistresses, no reign could last forever.